The security guard's hand hadn't even finished closing around her arm when the windows started shaking. Not an earthquake. Not thunder. Rotors. 3 military helicopters dropped out of the gray Colorado sky and hit the roof of Hartwell Memorial Hospital like a controlled explosion, blades screaming, downwash flattening everything below. The lobby lights flickered. A ceiling tile cracked loose and hit the floor. Every person inside froze. Then the doors blew open and 12 special operations soldiers poured through in full combat kit, rifles slung, eyes locked forward. They swept the lobby in under 8 seconds. One of them, a captain with a jaw like poured concrete, stopped in the center of the room, scanned the crowd, and said 4 words that turned the hospital director's face white. "Where's Laura Reyes?" The woman they were looking for was standing 6 feet away, holding a cardboard box. Badge already gone. If this story already has you gripping something, stay right here until the end. Hit follow so you don't miss what happens next. Drop a like if you felt that opening, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The morning had started the way most bad mornings do. Quietly, with no warning at all. Laura Reyes arrived at Hartwell Memorial at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before her shift, the same way she had arrived every morning for the past 4 years. The parking structure on the east side of the building was already half full. She pulled into a spot near the stairwell, cut the engine, and sat for a moment with her hands still on the wheel. Through the windshield, the hospital rose against the pre-dawn sky of Callaway, Montana. 8 stories of glass and poured concrete, lit from inside like something that never slept, because it didn't. She grabbed her bag and her travel mug and got out. Hartwell was not a glamorous hospital. It wasn't the kind of place that showed up in medical journals or attracted surgeons from out of state. It was a regional trauma center doing the work that needed doing. Car accidents off the mountain passes, farm injuries, cardiac events in people who'd put off going to a doctor for 6 years because the nearest specialist was 90 miles away. The ER carried most of that weight, and the ER staff knew it. They worked without extra credit and without much recognition, and most of them were fine with that. Laura had been fine with it for 4 years. She badged through the side entrance, nodded to the overnight security guy, and made her way to the ER locker room. Marlene Ochoa was in there already, pulling her hair back with the focused efficiency of someone who had done the same thing 1,000 mornings in a row. "How bad was overnight?" Laura asked. "MVA around 2. Guy walked away." Marlene snapped a hair tie into place. "Dr. Vargas is in a mood, so heads up." Dr. Vargas is always in a mood. More of a mood than usual. Laura changed, clipped her badge to her scrub top, and went to work. She was 34 years old and had the kind of face that people routinely underestimated. Soft features, dark eyes, the kind of quiet that some people read as passivity. She'd stopped correcting that impression years ago. Not because she didn't care, but because correcting it had never once made any difference. What most people at Hartwell didn't know, what Laura had never mentioned, not in her hiring paperwork, not in small talk, not in the 4 years she'd worked this floor, was that before she ever set foot in a civilian hospital, she had spent 8 years as a special operations combat medic in the United States Army. She had worked 2 combat deployments and 1 covert training assignment that didn't show up on any documents most people could access. She had stabilized gunshot wounds in the backs of moving vehicles. She had performed field thoracotomies without adequate light, without the right instruments, without a surgical team, just her hands and whatever she could improvise. She had kept people alive in conditions where keeping them alive should not have been possible. She didn't lead with any of that. It wasn't modesty exactly. It was more that she had learned a long time ago that the work either spoke for itself or it didn't, and no amount of talking changed which one it was going to be. The morning moved fast. Hartwell's ER ran lean. 3 nurses, 1 attending, 1 resident rotating through. By 9 o'clock, they'd seen a broken wrist, a respiratory infection in a 70-year-old man who'd waited too long to come in, and a 15-year-old with a laceration on his forearm from a fence post that needed 8 stitches. Laura sutured the laceration while the attending, Dr. Patricia Holt, fielded a call from the ICU. The kid was trying not to look at his own arm. "You doing okay?" Laura asked. "It looks worse than it feels." "They usually do." He laughed a little despite himself, which was the point. By 10:30, the ER had gone briefly quiet. That particular silence never lasted, but while it held, Laura stood at the nursing station updating charts and watching the board. 3 patients in rooms, 1 pending lab results. Routine for the moment. That was when Dr. Marcus Hale walked through. He didn't come to the ER often. Hale was a thoracic surgeon, one of 2 in Callaway, which meant the hospital treated him like something between an asset and a liability. He was 51, heavy through the shoulders, and carried himself with the particular confidence of someone who had never once in his professional life been told he was wrong by anyone whose opinion he respected. His hair was silver, his handshake was firm. He smiled often in ways that did not reach his eyes. Laura noticed him come through and went back to her charting. Whatever Hale was doing in the ER at 10:30 was not her concern, except it was about to be. He stopped at the room where the respiratory patient, James Abbott, 71, retired schoolteacher, was resting pending his labs. Laura watched Hale go in, speak briefly to the man, and come back out. Then he stopped at the medication cart near the station and pulled up something on the wall-mounted tablet. Laura had been watching the board when the override happened. She saw the flag appear on Abbott's chart. She looked up. Hale was signing off on a medication order. The problem was that Laura had already reviewed Abbott's intake history when he came in. The man was on 2 anticoagulants, a combination flagged in his chart under allergic interactions. The medication Hale had just ordered would create a 3rd overlap. In a 71-year-old with the respiratory numbers Abbott was running, that combination carried a meaningful bleed risk. Not theoretical, real. Laura walked over. "Dr. Hale?" She kept her voice level. "Mr. Abbott's on warfarin and aspirin therapy. The ketorolac order is going to create an anticoagulant overlap. I want to flag it before it goes to pharmacy." Hale looked at her the way someone looks at a door that is opened at an inconvenient moment. "I'm aware of his medication history," he said. "His chart shows a prior GI bleed in 2019, with his current respiratory distress and the site." "Nurse," the word landed with a particular weight he clearly intended. "I have been practicing thoracic surgery for 22 years. I think I can manage a medication order without a review from the floor." Laura didn't move. "I'm not questioning your experience. I'm documenting a concern for patient safety. That's my responsibility under—" "Your responsibility," Hale said, "is to execute orders, not audit them." He walked away. Laura stood at the cart for a moment. Then she picked up the chart, went to the nursing station, and opened the incident documentation system. She typed the concern: medication flagged, interaction risk identified, attending informed, order not modified. She added Abbott's intake history and the prior GI bleed notation. She submitted it and hit the notification flag that sent a copy to the charge nurse and the patient safety coordinator. It was not the first time she had filed a flag on a Hale order. It was the 14th. The pharmacy held the ketorolac order pending review, which was standard protocol when a nursing flag came in. Hale found out about the hold 40 minutes later and appeared at the nursing station with a precision that suggested he'd been containing himself the entire walk from the surgical wing. "You filed a safety flag on my order." "Yes. After I explicitly told you the order was appropriate. After I documented a patient safety concern. They're not the same thing." His voice dropped to the kind of quiet that was meant to be more frightening than shouting. "Let me be very clear with you. You are a floor nurse. I am a board-certified thoracic surgeon with privileges at 3 hospitals in this state. When I tell you an order has been reviewed, the conversation is over. The next time you insert yourself into my clinical decisions, I will go to administration, and this will become a very different kind of conversation." Laura looked at him for a moment. "Mr. Abbott is 71, with compromised respiratory function and a prior bleed history," she said. "If he hemorrhages, it won't matter who had privileges where. I'll continue to flag concerns as I'm required to by patient safety protocol. That's not going to change." Hale's jaw tightened. Then he turned and left. James Abbott's ketorolac order was modified by the attending physician on review. His medication regimen was adjusted. 2 days later, he was discharged without complication. Laura filed her documentation and moved on to the next patient. She should have known that wasn't the end of it. In the weeks that followed, small things shifted. Her schedule was adjusted, not dramatically, but enough. Her access to certain non-urgent patient consultations was quietly redirected to a senior nurse. During a staff meeting she wasn't informed about until an hour before it started, Dr. Hale presented what he framed as a communication protocol review for nursing staff, which was structured in ways that made every person in the room glance at Laura at least once. She kept filing. 4 more safety incidents over 6 weeks. 2 involved medication discrepancies. 1 involved a post-op patient whose drainage output had been recorded at values that didn't match what Laura observed during her own assessment. The numbers were off in ways that looked like transcription error, but followed a pattern she'd started recognizing. The 4th was a surgical scheduling conflict she'd flagged to the charge nurse after noticing that a patient's pre-op labs had come back with results that should have delayed the procedure. The labs were reordered. The procedure was postponed 2 days. The patient did fine. The charge nurse told Laura privately that Hale had gone to the nursing director after that one. He's going to push for a performance review, the charge nurse said. Her name was Sandra Page, and she was a decent person trying to operate in a system that did not always reward decent people. I'm not telling you to stop flagging. I'm telling you what's coming. I know what's coming, Laura said. Laura, he has a lot of pull here. I know that too. Sandra looked at her for a moment with something that was partly frustration and partly something that looked like admiration and partly the exhaustion of someone who'd seen this movie before. Okay, she said. Okay. Well, the performance review happened on a Tuesday. It was chaired by Hartwell's Director of Nursing Operations, a woman named Diane Forsyth, who ran meetings with the brisk efficiency of someone who had learned to confuse speed with fairness. Present also were an HR representative named Todd Garfield, and sitting slightly apart from the others in a way that was meant to look casual, Dr. Marcus Hale. The document in front of Forsyth described Laura as having demonstrated a pattern of insubordinate behavior toward attending physicians, including repeated attempts to override clinical decisions outside the scope of nursing responsibilities. Laura had read it the night before. She'd printed it out, in fact, and gone through it with a highlighter and a pen, noting every characterization that didn't match her documented records. I'd like to address the characterization of my flags as attempts to override clinical decisions, she said when Forsyth had finished the summary. This isn't a rebuttal session, Garfield said. You've presented a characterization of my professional conduct. I'm providing the documentation to contextualize it. That's not a rebuttal. That's the other half of the record. She placed 14 printed incident reports on the table. Each one had the date, the patient identifier, the specific concern flagged, and the outcome. In 11 of the 14 documented cases, the flagged concern resulted in a modified order, a delayed procedure, or a clinical review that changed the outcome. In 2 cases, no modification was made, and I documented that as well. 1 case is still pending follow-up. These aren't overrides. They're the patient safety reporting system functioning as designed. The silence in the room had a specific texture to it. Hale was the one who broke it. The volume of flags you've submitted against my orders specifically represents a targeted pattern of disruption, he said. Regardless of outcome, the behavior undermines the authority structure that effective patient care depends on. Patient safety protocols exist precisely because authority structures don't self-correct, Laura said. That's documented in the Joint Commission framework this hospital operates under. You're a nurse, Hale said, not a physician, not an administrator, a nurse. And I'm doing what nurses are supposed to do. Forsyth cleared her throat and looked at both of them with the expression of someone who had already made up her mind before walking into the room and was now performing the appearance of deliberation. Ms. Reyes, she said, the committee has reviewed the pattern of behavior and will be issuing a formal written warning. Additionally, your schedule will be restructured to limit patient overlap with Dr. Hale's surgical cases going forward. Laura looked at her. You're scheduling me around a physician to reduce safety flags. We're restructuring to improve team communication. That's not what that is. Ms. Reyes, it's not, Laura said. She kept her voice completely even, and I want that distinction noted in the record. Garfield was already typing. Laura didn't know whether he was noting it or burying it. She found out 3 weeks later that it had been buried. The morning she was fired started the same way most mornings did. quietly, with no warning at all. She had been called to Forsyth's office at 7:15 before her shift technically began. That alone was enough of a signal that she'd come in already knowing at some level what the meeting was going to contain. She'd walked through the ER on her way and stopped for a moment at the nursing station, looked at the board, the rooms, the rhythm of the place she'd spent 4 years learning. Sandra was behind the desk. She didn't say anything. Neither did Laura. Forsyth's office smelled like the same vanilla candle it always smelled like. Garfield was there again. Hale was not, but his absence felt deliberate, like he'd decided it was beneath him to witness the part he'd engineered. "We're terminating your employment effective immediately," Forsyth said. The decision was made at the administrative level following a comprehensive review of— "What was the review?" Laura asked. "Your performance record, including the disciplinary warning issued 6 weeks ago and a subsequent review of your recent conduct." "What conduct specifically?" Forsyth set down the paper. "Ms. Reyes, this conversation doesn't require your— I'm entitled to know the specific basis for termination." Garfield slid a single sheet across the desk. Laura picked it up. It cited the formal warning, then listed 2 additional incidents, both described in language she didn't recognize as accurate, and one of which referenced a patient encounter she was certain had been documented differently in the actual chart. She put the paper down. "I'd like a copy of this." "We'll provide documentation through the standard HR process." "I want it now." "Ms. Reyes, I've just been terminated." "I'd like the paperwork I'm legally entitled to before I leave this office." There was a pause. Garfield printed a copy and handed it across the desk. Laura folded it, placed it in the inside pocket of her jacket, and stood up. "Your access badge will be deactivated upon exit," Forsyth said. "Security will accompany you to retrieve your personal items." Laura nodded once and walked out. The security guard's name was Carl, and to his credit, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. He waited in the hallway while she gathered what was in her locker, which wasn't much. A change of shoes, a book she'd been meaning to finish, a photograph of her sister's kids from 3 years ago that she'd stuck to the inside of the door with a piece of tape that had long since gone yellow at the edges. She put everything in a cardboard box that Carl had produced from somewhere. She didn't know where he'd gotten it. She didn't ask. They walked together back through the ER toward the main lobby. Laura kept her eyes forward. She was aware of the people watching, the ones who looked away, the ones who didn't. She had expected this to feel worse than it did. It felt mostly like a particular kind of cold, the kind that doesn't hurt yet. Carl held the lobby door for her, and that was when the windows shook. Not immediately. There was about 2 seconds of warning before the sound fully arrived, a low rhythmic thunder that seemed to come from everywhere at once, pressure changing in her ears before she understood what she was hearing. Then 3 military helicopters descended through the cloud cover above Hartwell Memorial Hospital, and the world changed. They came in fast and controlled, hitting the rooftop landing pads with the kind of precision that only came from people who had done this under much worse conditions. The downwash rolled down the exterior of the building and hit the lobby windows with enough force to set off 2 car alarms in the parking structure. Inside, the ceiling lights stuttered. Someone dropped something ceramic somewhere down a hallway and it shattered. Carl had stopped walking. So had Laura. The lobby doors blew open before she could process what was happening, and then there were soldiers everywhere, 12 of them, fast and deliberate, rifles slung but hands ready, fanning out through the entry in a pattern she recognized from a very different context in her life. Combat-ready perimeter sweep. Controlled and professional and absolutely unmistakable. The tallest one, a captain with a scar along his left jaw and the particular stillness of someone who didn't waste energy on things that didn't matter, stopped in the center of the lobby and looked around the room. "We need Laura Reyes," he said. Not a question. The lobby was completely silent. "Right now," the captain said. And Carl, the security guard who had just walked Laura out of the building with a cardboard box, turned his head and looked directly at her. Every set of eyes in the lobby followed. Laura stood there with the box in her hands, her badge gone, the termination paperwork folded in her jacket pocket, and looked at the captain. "I'm Reyes," she said. The captain's expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. A fractional release of tension that told her everything she needed to know about how urgent the last hour had been for him. "We have a critical," he said. "Commander Dario Salcedo, chest trauma, deteriorating. He was evacuated from a forward location 40 minutes ago. Before he went under, he gave us one name." He looked at her. "Yours." Behind her, somewhere deeper in the hospital, she heard a door open, heard footsteps, heard, just barely, the voice of Dr. Marcus Hale saying something to someone that she couldn't quite make out, something that ended with the word nurse, in a tone that she had learned to identify over the past several months. She set the cardboard box on the floor beside Carl's left foot. "Show me your patient," she said. The captain's name was Rourke, and he moved like someone who had spent years operating in places where slowing down was how people died. He led her through the lobby at a pace that made the hospital staff scatter automatically, the soldiers fanning out around them in a loose protective formation that Laura recognized without thinking about it. Standard VIP escort, modified for indoor terrain. She'd walked inside formations like this before, in different clothes, in different countries, under very different circumstances. Her body remembered the rhythm of it before her mind fully caught up. "What's the mechanism?" she asked as they moved. "IED blast. Proximity, not direct. Right side took most of it." Rourke kept his eyes on the hallway ahead. He was in the vehicle, so the door absorbed some of the force. "We think there's rib fractures. He's been hypoxic since extraction." "How long?" 50 minutes of transport. Vitals were holding until about 12 minutes out, then his pressure started dropping. "Sat?" 88 when we landed. Laura ran the numbers without breaking stride. Hypoxia, dropping pressure, right-sided chest trauma after blast exposure. The differential wasn't long. At the top of it was a tension pneumothorax, which would kill Dario Salcedo in the next few minutes if that's what it was and nobody had caught it yet. "Who's been managing him on the bird?" "Our medic, Corporal Tate. She's been with him since extraction." "What did she give him?" 2 large-bore IVs, saline wide open, supplemental O2 at 15 liters. She wanted to needle him, but wasn't confident in the presentation. That told Laura something about Corporal Tate that she filed away, that the medic had been uncertain enough to hold off rather than act wrong. That was good instinct. Wrong side needle decompression in a blast trauma patient made things worse faster than almost anything. They pushed through a set of double doors into the main trauma corridor, and Laura heard the patient before she saw him. Commander Dario Salcedo was on a gurney in Trauma Bay 2, and he sounded like a man trying to breathe through a wet cloth. He was 43, broad-shouldered, the kind of physical build that usually absorbed damage better than average, and right now none of that was helping him. His color was wrong, dusky around the lips, the particular gray-blue that Laura associated with bad oxygen numbers, and less time than anyone wanted to admit. A young woman in field uniform, Corporal Tate, had to be, was bagging him manually and watching the monitor with the focused expression of someone working very hard not to panic. Dr. Rafael Estrada, the ER attending on duty, was at the bedside. He was a competent physician, Laura knew, methodical, careful, not someone who cut corners. He had his stethoscope out and was listening to Salcedo's chest with his eyes closed, which was the right thing to be doing, and which was also, from the look on his face, not giving him a clear picture. Standing behind Estrada, arms crossed, was Dr. Marcus Hale. Laura had about half a second to process that particular complication before she was at the bedside and her attention locked onto the patient. "Breath sounds?" she asked. Estrada looked up. Whatever he was going to say about her presence, and she could see him calculating it, he set it aside. "Diminished on the right. Trachea's midline, but just barely. Just barely isn't midline." She pulled on gloves from the box at the head of the gurney and put her hand on Salcedo's chest. Even through the glove, she could feel the tension in the chest wall on the right side, the skin slightly distended, the rib architecture wrong under her fingers. She leaned down and listened with her own stethoscope. No breath sounds on the right. None. The left side was working twice as hard to compensate. She straightened up. Tension pneumo, right side. He needs needle decompression now. Estrada hesitated. Not because he doubted her, she thought, but because the word now from someone who had just been walked out of the building with a cardboard box created a particular kind of cognitive friction. His trachea is about to deviate and then his pressure's going to bottom out. We have maybe 2 minutes. She was already moving toward the supply cart. I need a 14-gauge needle, at least 3.5 inch, and I need it right now. She doesn't have privileges in this hospital, Hale said. The words landed in the room with a flatness that was almost surreal given what was on the gurney in front of them. Laura found the needle she needed and turned around. Captain Rourke, she said without looking away from the patient, what's your unit standing on medical authority during active casualty evacuation? Rourke was already there. Commander Salcedo designated you as primary medical contact under Special Operations Medical Directive. That authorizes your involvement in his care regardless of civilian facility credentialing during active transport status. That directive doesn't supersede hospital, Hale started. Dr. Hale. Estrada's voice was quiet and very final. Step back. Hale went silent. Laura wasn't sure she'd ever heard him go silent that fast before. She positioned herself at Salcedo's right chest, identified the second intercostal space at the midclavicular line by feel. Trauma bay lighting was good, but she wasn't trusting it over her fingers, and inserted the needle. The hiss of released air was immediate and unmistakable. The sound of pressure that had been building somewhere it shouldn't be finally finding an exit. Salcedo's oxygen saturation, which had been sitting at 86 on the monitor, jumped to 91 within 30 seconds. Corporal Tate exhaled through her nose. There it is, she said quietly. Salcedo's color began to shift. Not all the way back, not yet, but the gray was retreating from his lips. His breathing, still assisted, had a different quality to it, less desperate, more mechanical. His blood pressure ticked up on the monitor, 90/60, better than it had been. Estrada stepped up beside Laura and they worked in parallel without talking. The specific wordless efficiency of two people who have done similar work enough times that the tasks distribute themselves. She called for a chest tube setup. He was already reaching for it. He's going to need imaging, she said. I'm calling CT. He might not make CT. I want a bedside ultrasound first. Estrada nodded and flagged the tech. No argument. Whatever hierarchy had existed in this room 8 minutes ago had rearranged itself around the person doing the work. Behind them, Dr. Hale had not left the room. Laura was aware of him the way you're aware of a door that isn't quite closed. A peripheral wrongness she didn't have bandwidth to address yet. The bedside ultrasound confirmed what she already suspected. Salcedo had a hemothorax on the right in addition to the pneumothorax, meaning blood was also accumulating in the chest cavity and would need to be drained. The ribs, she could see the fractures clearly on the image, were a mess on the right side. 3 confirmed breaks, a possible 4th. The pattern was consistent with blast wave injury transmitted through the vehicle door, which meant the ribcage had essentially been used as a shock absorber. He was also showing fluid around the pericardium, which was the number that made the hair on the back of Laura's neck stand up. He's got a pericardial effusion, she said. Small, but it's there. We need cardiothoracic. On call is Dr. Winters, the charge nurse said from the door, 40 minutes out. Call her and tell her to step on it. Laura kept her eyes on the screen. And get me a thoracic surgery consult set up in case we can't wait. I can perform the consult, Hale said. Laura looked at the ultrasound image for one more second, then looked up. She had about 15 different things she could have said. She chose the one that was actually useful. Fine. Pull up and look at this. Whatever Hale had expected from her, it wasn't that. He came to the screen with the slight hesitation of someone who had prepared for a fight and hadn't gotten it. He looked at the image. She watched his face change, the professional part of him overriding whatever personal agenda he'd walked in with, because the image didn't care about agendas. Effusion small, he said, right now. Blast mechanism means the pericardium could be more compromised than the image shows. I want it watched every 15 minutes. Agreed. The word came out of him like it cost something. Laura filed that away and turned back to the patient. Salcedo was conscious now, barely, intermittently, the way badly injured people sometimes surfaced in waves. His eyes opened and then closed and then opened again. And the first time they focused on Laura. "Hey," she said. She leaned slightly into his line of sight. "You're at a hospital. You're being taken care of. You're okay." His lips moved. She bent closer. "Reyes," he said. His voice was barely there. "Yeah, I'm here." Something in his expression loosened. Not relief exactly, more like the particular letting go of someone who had been holding on to one thing and had finally found it. His eyes closed again. Behind her, she heard Captain Rourke say something quiet to one of his soldiers. She didn't catch the words, but she caught the tone. It was the tone of someone checking a box that had been urgently unchecked for the past several hours. The next 40 minutes were the kind of controlled chaos that looked like disorder from the outside and felt like a very specific kind of focus from the inside. Salcedo went to CT after the bedside ultrasound, with Laura and Corporal Tate both accompanying the gurney, which was not standard protocol and which nobody argued about. The images confirmed the rib fractures, the hemothorax, and the pericardial effusion, which had not grown in the interval between scans. That was the good news. The bad news was a small liver laceration that the blast concussion had produced, which was currently not bleeding actively, but which the trauma surgery team was going to need to know about immediately. She called that in herself. Trauma surgery sent down Dr. Miriam Osei, who arrived moving fast and assessed the situation with the brisk competence of someone who had been woken up from a call room nap and was not going to let that slow her down. Laura gave her the rundown in about 90 seconds. Osei listened without interrupting, looked at the CT images on the tablet Laura handed her, and said, "Okay, he goes upstairs. Cardiothoracic is 40 out. 30 now. I'll coordinate with Winters when she arrives. You'll be in the OR." It was a question with a very specific weight to it, given the circumstances. "If the patient's care requires it," Laura said. Osei looked at her for one beat. "The patient's care is going to require it," she said, and walked toward the elevator. Laura stood in the corridor outside the CT suite and let herself breathe for approximately 4 seconds. She was aware of the soldiers still stationed at both ends of the hallway, not intrusively, just present, the way a specific kind of professional presence makes itself felt without demanding attention. Rourke was at the far end on his phone. His posture suggested the conversation was significant. She pulled out her own phone and stared at it for a moment. There were 2 texts from Sandra Page, both sent in the last 20 minutes. She opened the first one. "What is happening?" The second one was just, "Hale is losing his mind up here." Laura put the phone back in her pocket and went back to the patient. Salcedo went into surgery at 11:47. Laura scrubbed in alongside Dr. Osei and 2 surgical residents, with Dr. Winters arriving with 9 minutes to spare and integrating into the OR with the efficiency of someone used to joining procedures already in progress. The pericardial effusion, as it turned out, was larger on direct visualization than the ultrasound had suggested. Not dangerously so, but enough that Winters drained it before they addressed the rib stabilization, which was the right call. It was a long surgery, 4 hours and change, with one complication around the 2-hour mark when Salcedo's pressure dropped suddenly, and they spent 20 minutes managing a bleed from the liver laceration that had decided it was no longer willing to stay quiet. Laura caught it before Osei verbalized it, called the suction, adjusted the retraction, and didn't say anything afterward because the work was the work, and it didn't need commentary. Osei said afterward, "You've done this before." "Different context." "How different?" "Very." Osei looked at her for a moment and then nodded. The way people nod when they decide to let something go because pursuing it would take longer than they have. They closed at 3:52 in the afternoon. Salcedo's vitals were stable. His numbers, which had been terrifying at 11 a.m., were numbers she could look at without her jaw tightening. She stripped her gloves in the scrub corridor and stood there for a moment, back against the wall, eyes on the ceiling. Her feet hurt. She hadn't eaten since the travel mug of coffee she'd had in the car at 5:47 that morning. Her jacket, with the termination paperwork folded inside it, was in a locker downstairs that she wasn't technically allowed to access anymore. None of that was immediate. None of that was what mattered right now. She pushed off the wall and went to the family waiting area, where Captain Rourke was the only person sitting, and where he stood up the moment she walked in. "He's out," she said. "Stable. They'll keep him under for a few hours to let the system quiet down, but the critical window is closed. Rourke's shoulders did something she wouldn't have called relief on anyone else, but on him it was unmistakable. "Good," he said. "That's good." He was quiet for a second. "Thank you." "Don't." He looked at her. "He made it because the damage wasn't beyond fixing," she said. "I just found the problem fast enough." Rourke studied her face for a moment. Then he said, "He told me about you before this, a few months ago, actually. We were talking about the Kandahar rotation, and he mentioned your name. Said if he ever got seriously hurt, you were the one he'd want managing his care." Laura didn't say anything. "I don't think he expected to ever actually need to call it in," Rourke said. "Nobody does." She turned to leave, and Rourke said, "Ms. Reyes?" She stopped. "I understand the hospital terminated your employment this morning." "Yes. My unit's JAG officer has been asking me questions since about 15 minutes after we landed," he said. "I think you should know that." She processed that for a moment. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that start with, what's the legal status of the personnel documentation that led to her dismissal?" Laura was quiet for a second. She thought about the 14 incident reports, the performance review, the termination paperwork with the inaccurately described patient encounter. "That's going to open something up," she said. "I know." Rourke held her gaze. "I thought you should know before it did." She nodded once and left the waiting area. Bummed. The something that opened up started, as these things often do, with a single question asked to the wrong person. The JAG officer, a major named Sandra Fielding, who Laura had not yet met, but whose existence she learned about in the next hour through 3 separate people telling her about it unprompted, had apparently gone to the hospital's medical records department at around 2 p.m. asking for a complete copy of Commander Salcedo's intake documentation and the nursing assessment records from that morning. Routine in theory. Standard procedure for a military medical involvement case. Except the records clerk who processed the request noticed something while pulling the files. An inconsistency in the timestamp metadata on 2 nursing assessment entries from earlier that week. Not Salcedo's records, unrelated records, flagged coincidentally because they were stored in an adjacent file partition that the request parameters had briefly opened access to. The clerk flagged it to her supervisor. The supervisor flagged it to the compliance officer. The compliance officer, a meticulous 44-year-old named Warren Yip, who had been asking uncomfortable questions in memos that nobody read for approximately 18 months, looked at the timestamp inconsistency and then pulled the full access log for the records that contained it. What he found was that 2 of Laura's original incident reports, the ones she'd filed through the patient safety system, had been accessed, and their submission timestamps modified approximately 72 hours after she'd filed them. The modification didn't change the content, it changed the sequence, making them appear to have been filed after the patient outcomes they described rather than before, which transformed them from predictive safety flags into retrospective documentation. The difference was significant. A predictive safety flag carried weight. A retrospective note looked like self-serving record keeping. Someone had altered the metadata to change the story. Warren Yip printed the access log, looked at the login credentials that had made the modifications, and sat at his desk for about 5 minutes before he picked up the phone and called the compliance hotline rather than his direct supervisor, because his direct supervisor reported to the same vice president who reported to the same board member that Dr. Marcus Hale played golf with every 3rd Sunday. He called the state health department hotline instead. They answered on the second ring. Laura didn't know any of this yet when Dr. Hale found her in the corridor outside the surgical wing at 4:20 p.m. She was on her way to retrieve her jacket from the locker downstairs and figure out what came next, and she almost walked past him before he stepped into her path. He had a specific expression on his face that she hadn't seen from him before. Not anger, she'd seen that. Not contempt, she'd seen that too. This was something that sat behind both of those things, something more fundamental that she didn't have a clean name for. "Whatever you think is happening," he said, "you should think very carefully about your next steps." She stopped walking. "Okay." "You performed a procedure in this hospital today without privileges. Military authorization or not, there are liability implications. And the people you're apparently talking to, he stopped, recalibrated. The soldiers who came here today are going to leave. They're going to go back to wherever they came from, and you're going to be a former employee with a disciplinary record and a termination on your professional history. Laura looked at him. Your patient's stable, she said. You're welcome. Something crossed his face. It happened fast, but she caught it. A flash of something that wasn't quite shame, but was adjacent to it, complicated by the fact that she thought, on some level, he might actually know that she was right, and that knowing it was exactly what was making this moment so difficult for him. I'm trying to tell you something, he said, and his voice had dropped in a way that wasn't threatening anymore. It was almost, she thought, a warning in a different register. I know what you're trying to tell me, she said. I've known for months. She walked around him. She was almost to the elevator when her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. It was Sandra Page. The text was 4 words long. They're pulling the records. Laura stood at the elevator door and read it twice. Then she pressed the button and waited, and the elevator didn't come. And in the silence, she became aware of a sound coming from the direction of the administration wing. Voices, multiple, moving fast, with the particular texture of people who have just discovered that a situation they thought they controlled has developed a dimension they didn't account for. The elevator arrived. She stepped in. As the doors closed, she caught a glimpse of 2 people she didn't recognize coming through the main doors at the end of the corridor. Not hospital staff, not soldiers. Business clothes. Lanyards with IDs she was too far away to read. The doors shut. She stared at her reflection in the brushed steel interior and thought about timestamp metadata and access logs and the 18 months of documentation she had filed in good faith through a system that someone had been quietly dismantling behind her. The elevator stopped on the 2nd floor for reasons she didn't understand and opened on an empty hallway, then closed again without anyone getting on. Then it continued down to the lobby, where Captain Rourke was waiting for her with Major Sandra Fielding standing at his right shoulder, holding a tablet, and wearing the expression of someone who has just finished reading something that has changed the scope of her afternoon considerably. Miss Reyes, Fielding said, I think we need to sit down. The conference room they put her in was on the 1st floor, just off the main lobby, a room Laura had walked past 100 times without ever being inside it. It had a long table, 8 chairs, a whiteboard with something half erased on it from a meeting that had happened days ago, and a window that looked out onto the east parking structure. She could see her car from where she sat. She'd been looking at it for about 30 seconds when Major Fielding set the tablet face up on the table between them. I'm going to walk you through what we have so far, Fielding said. I want you to tell me if anything conflicts with your recollection. Okay. Fielding was not what Laura had expected. She was in her late 30s, compact, with reading glasses pushed up on her head that she kept forgetting were there and reaching for. She had the deliberate patience of someone who had learned that moving fast through a conversation often meant missing the thing that mattered. The access log from your hospital's electronic records system shows that 2 patient safety reports you filed in October were accessed by a user account registered to a Diane Forsyth on October 23rd, 6 days after you filed them. The submission timestamps on both reports were modified during that access session. Fielding turned the tablet so Laura could see the screen. The content of the reports wasn't changed. The timestamps were moved forward by 11 days, which repositioned them chronologically to after the clinical events they described. Laura looked at the screen. She'd known something was wrong with the record. She hadn't known the specific mechanism until this moment. Who else had access to that system at the administrative level? She asked. That's what we're working through. Forsyth's credentials were used. Whether Forsyth was the one using them is a separate question. Fielding pulled the tablet back. The compliance officer who found this, Warren Yip, he called the state hotline this afternoon rather than going through internal channels. You know him? I know who he is. We've spoken twice. He told the hotline reviewer that he'd flagged records anomalies in internal memos on 3 separate occasions over the past 18 months and received no substantive response. Laura thought about 18 months of memos landing in an inbox that fed into the same administrative structure that had been apparently modifying the records the memos were about. She thought about Warren Yip printing the access log and deciding the internal channels were not a viable route. She understood that decision completely. What happens now? She asked. The state health department has mandatory notification obligations once a compliance hotline report comes in with this type of documentation. They've already contacted the Montana Department of Public Health and Human Services. Given that a federal military asset was treated here today, my office has concurrent jurisdiction on the records that relate to Commander Salcedo's care, which is how I'm in this room right now. Fielding took off her reading glasses, which she'd finally gotten back onto her nose, and set them on the table. Ms. Reyes, I need to ask you something directly. Go ahead. The 14 safety reports you filed, do you have independent copies? Laura reached into her jacket pocket and unfolded the termination paperwork. She slid it across. That's what they gave me when I left. My copies of the reports are at home, printed, dated, with the original submission confirmation emails. I started keeping them off-site after the second one. Fielding looked at the termination paper, then at Laura. After the second one, she repeated. I'd been doing this long enough to know how it goes, Laura said. Rourke, who had been standing near the window and hadn't spoken since they sat down, made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. The next hour moved in a specific way that Laura had learned in a previous life to recognize as the early mechanics of an official process gaining momentum. It had a particular texture, a lot of controlled activity happening in adjacent spaces, people moving with purpose through hallways, the specific quiet of a building that has not yet announced what it knows, but is in the process of deciding how to announce it. Fielding's team, 2 other officers who had arrived while Laura was in surgery and whom she hadn't seen until now, were working from a table in the lobby with laptops and a portable printer that was generating pages at a steady rate. Major Fielding herself moved between the conference room and the hallway with the focused economy of someone managing several threads simultaneously and not dropping any of them. At 5:15, Warren Yip knocked on the conference room door. He was a slight man with wire-framed glasses and the particular brand of careful composure that belongs to people who have been right about something uncomfortable for a long time and are now watching events confirm it in real time. He had a folder under his arm. Ms. Reyes, he said, I wanted you to know the state reviewer I spoke to this afternoon has already flagged this for expedited review. Given the nature of the metadata modification, they're treating it as potential evidence tampering. Thank you for making the call, Laura said. Yip looked at her for a moment. I should have made it 6 months ago. I made it internally instead, which he stopped. Anyway, I thought you should know where it stands. He left the folder on the table and went back out. Laura opened it. Inside were the memos Yip had referenced, 3 of them, the earliest dated 14 months ago. The language was careful, bureaucratic, the kind of writing that was designed to document a concern without making it sound like an accusation. Reading between the lines of that careful language, the concern was the same one Laura had been filing about through the patient safety system. Different angle, same problem. Hale had been the problem for a long time before she arrived. She'd known that, suspected it. Seeing it documented in black and white by someone else, in memos predating her tenure, did something specific to the part of her that had spent the past several months second-guessing the volume of her own concern. She put the folder down. Through the conference room window, she watched 2 women she didn't recognize enter the hospital through the main lobby doors and go directly to the front desk. Business clothes, the kind that signaled purpose rather than appointment. They had the posture of people who had been sent somewhere rather than choosing to come. She couldn't hear what they said to the desk staff. She watched the desk staff make a phone call. The 2 women waited with the patience of people accustomed to waiting in exactly this way. State Health Department, she thought. They were faster than she'd expected. Dr. Marcus Hale found out the state reviewers were in the building at approximately 5:40 p.m., which Laura knew because she heard him in the hallway. She didn't hear what he said specifically. She heard the register of it. The shift from the controlled authority he maintained most of the time to something with a different edge underneath. She heard the word protocol twice and the phrase my attorney once, and then she heard footsteps moving fast in the direction of the administrative wing. Captain Rourke, who had come back to the conference room doorway, said, "Sounds like word got out." "Sounds like it." "You doing okay?" Laura considered the question seriously for a moment. "I'm hungry," she said. "I haven't eaten since this morning. Rourke reached into a pocket of his kit and produced a protein bar with the matter-of-fact economy of someone who had provided emergency nutrition in considerably worse conditions. She took it. "Thank you. Don't mention it." She ate half of it and stared at the table and thought about what Fielding had said about evidence tampering and about what that meant in terms of the people who had built the performance review, and about Diane Forsyth signing the termination order, and about Todd Garfield printing a page and sliding it across a desk. She thought about the patient whose pre-op labs she'd flagged, who'd had his procedure delayed by 2 days, who'd gone home fine. She thought about James Abbott, 71, retired schoolteacher, who'd been discharged without the GI bleed that the ketorolac order would very likely have caused. These were not abstract outcomes. They were specific people who were still alive and intact in ways they might not have been. That was the part nobody in the administrative review had ever engaged with directly. They had talked about protocol and authority structure and professional boundaries. They had talked about everything except the patients. She finished the protein bar and waited. At 6:10, Fielding came back into the conference room with a different expression than she'd left with. "We've got a problem," she said. Laura looked up. "Dr. Hale has an attorney en route. That part isn't surprising, and it's not the problem." Fielding sat down. "The problem is that our records request has turned up a discrepancy we weren't looking for. There are 2 incident reports in the system that don't appear in the printed copies you provided." Laura frowned. 2 reports I filed that aren't in my copies?" "No. Reversed. 2 reports in your printed set that don't appear in the system at all. They've been deleted, not just modified. Deleted. The filing confirmation emails you have would be the only documentation of their submission." The room was quiet for a second. Laura thought back through the 14 reports. She could reconstruct most of them from memory. Dates, patients, concerns raised. 2 of them, both filed in late September, had involved a patient whose post-surgical drainage record she'd flagged as inconsistent. The patient had been under Hale's care. The drainage numbers in the chart hadn't matched her observation, which she'd documented and filed. She'd also included in those reports that the inconsistency followed a pattern she'd identified in 2 prior cases. Those were the ones, she was sure of it. "The September reports," she said, "about the drainage recording discrepancy." Fielding looked at her steadily. "Can you reconstruct what was in them?" "Most of it. I'd need to go back through my notes from that period." "Your notes are at home." "Yes." "Are they detailed?" "Yes." Fielding absorbed this. The fact that the deletion shows up in the audit trail at all is because the system maintains deletion logs. Someone accessed those reports and deleted them using administrative credentials on November 2nd. That's 5 days before your performance review. Laura sat with that for a moment. 5 days before the performance review that had resulted in her formal warning. Someone had deleted the 2 reports that most directly documented a pattern, not a single incident, a pattern, of record inconsistency under Hale's cases. Without those 2 reports, her 14-flag record looked like a nurse who had difficulty working with a specific physician. With them, it looked like something else entirely. "Who had administrative record deletion privileges?" she asked. "We're working through that. It requires a supervisor-level credential and a secondary authorization. So at minimum 2 people. Fielding paused. "Ms. Reyes, I want to be direct with you about where this is going. What started this morning as a records request related to Commander Salcedo's intake has become something considerably larger than that. The state reviewers are here. My JAG office has flagged this for federal review because of the military angle. What you're holding in your filing confirmation emails is potentially material evidence in a case that is no longer just about your termination." "I understand. I need those emails secured tonight. I can get them to you within the hour." Fielding nodded. She started to stand, then stopped. "One more thing. The patient whose drainage records you flagged in September. I need the patient identifiers from your memory if you can reconstruct them, even partial. Our records team can cross-reference." Laura closed her eyes for a moment. She hadn't thought about that case in several weeks, had filed it, and moved forward the way she moved forward with all of them, but the details were still there. That was the thing about this kind of work. The details didn't leave. They settled into a specific part of memory that was separate from general recall and considerably harder to lose. She gave Fielding what she had. 2 patient identifiers partial, The approximate date range, the specific ward, the nature of the discrepancy. Fielding wrote it down without commenting. Then she left. The hospital had shifted into a particular register by 7 p.m. that Laura recognized as institutional crisis management, the kind that happened when an organization realized the story it had been telling about itself was about to be publicly contested. She saw it in the way the front desk staff kept looking toward the administrative wing. She saw it in the speed at which people moved through hallways they would normally walk. She heard it in the brevity of conversations being had just outside the conference room door, which kept getting shorter the closer those conversations got to whatever was happening upstairs. Sandra Page appeared in the doorway at 7:15. She looked like someone who had spent the afternoon being asked questions she didn't know how to answer, which was probably exactly what had happened to her. "Hey," she said. "Hey." Sandra came in and sat down across from her. She was quiet for a moment in the way of someone assembling what she wants to say. "I didn't know," she said finally. "About the timestamp thing. I want you to know that." "I know." "I knew something was wrong with the review process. I told you that, but I didn't know anyone had actually—" She stopped. "I should have pushed harder." "Sandra, I should have." "Maybe, but you also told me what was coming and gave me time to think about how to respond to it. That mattered." Sandra looked at her hands. "There are people upstairs right now who are very scared." "I imagine." Forsyth has been in her office with the door locked for 2 hours. Garfield went home. Sandra paused. "Hale is still here. He's in the surgical lounge with his lawyer. They've been there since 6. Laura thought about Hale in the surgical lounge with his attorney and thought about what that conversation probably looked like. She didn't feel the satisfaction she might have expected to feel. What she felt was something more like the particular exhaustion that comes from being right about something for a long time, in a context where being right didn't protect you from anything. "How's your patient?" Sandra asked. "The commander." "Stable. They'll bring him out of sedation tomorrow morning." That was something to watch, this morning. Sandra shook her head slightly. "When those helicopters hit the roof, I thought it was— I don't even know what I thought it was. And then Rourke comes through the door asking for you, and you're standing right there with a cardboard box." She almost laughed, then didn't. "You never told anyone." "There wasn't anything to tell. 8 years as an Army combat medic is something to tell." It didn't seem relevant to floor nursing. "Laura, I know it seems—" She stopped, tried to find the actual words for it. "When I came here, I wanted to just do the job, without the history attached to it. The history makes people assume things, and the assumptions get in the way of the work. I've seen it both directions." Sandra was quiet for a moment. "Both directions meaning?" "People defer to you when they shouldn't, or they don't take you seriously because they think the military thing means you don't know how civilian systems work. Either way, the work suffers." "So you just didn't say anything?" "So I just didn't say anything." Sandra nodded slowly, and they sat together for a while in the particular quiet of a building that is processing something too large for ordinary conversation. At 8:40 p.m., Laura's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer it. She stared at the number for the 4 seconds the first ring lasted, and something, instinct, or just the day she'd had, made her pick up. "Ms. Reyes." The voice was male, older, with the flat, careful diction of someone who had spent decades choosing words for legal precision. "My name is Owen Treadwell. I'm the Regional Director for the Montana Department of Public Health and Human Services. I've been briefed by our review team on site at Hartwell Memorial this evening." "Okay," Laura said. "I'm calling to inform you that based on the documentation we've reviewed today, we are opening a formal investigation into records management practices at this facility with specific focus on patient safety reporting systems and documentation integrity. That investigation will be conducted jointly with your state nursing board and, given the federal involvement today, in coordination with the relevant military legal office." A pause. "You will be contacted through formal channels in the coming days, but I wanted to make a personal call this evening because what our team has found today represents—" He stopped, and she heard him choosing his next words with care. "It represents a serious failure of the systems that are supposed to protect both patients and the clinical staff who advocate for them." Laura was quiet. Ms. Reyes, are you still there? Yes, I'm here. I want to ask you directly. Are you safe? Do you have representation? Do you have somewhere to go tonight? The question caught her off guard in a way that very little had that day. She almost said, I'm fine, the way she said it reflexively. The way she had said it for years when people asked. She stopped herself. I'm fine, she said anyway, because it was still true, just differently than it usually was. I have representation in process. I have somewhere to go. Good. Another pause. What you did today. For Commander Salcedo. Our reviewers mentioned it when they briefed me. She didn't respond. It seems to have been a very difficult day, Treadwell said, that ended rather differently than it started. Yes, she said. It did. She hung up and sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. Through the conference room window, the east parking structure was lit yellow-white against the dark. Her car was still there, third row, where she'd left it at 5:47 this morning. She was thinking about going to get it when the door opened and Captain Rourke came in fast, which was different from the way he'd moved all day, because Rourke's version of fast was usually contained. Salcedo's awake, he said. Earlier than expected. He's asking for you. She stood up immediately. He's not supposed to talk. Ose will have him sedated again in 20 minutes to let him get ahead of the pain cycle, Rourke said, already moving toward the door. But he's been awake for 6 minutes, and the first thing he said when he could form words was your name, and the second thing he said was that he needed to talk to you before they put him back under. They went up together. 4th floor, post-surgical ICU, the particular antiseptic quiet of a unit that never fully turned its lights off. Ose was at the nurse's station and gave Laura a look that said 10 minutes, maximum, without saying anything out loud. Salcedo was in the second room. He looked like someone who had been through surgery that lasted 4 hours, which meant he looked terrible and also alive. And right now, alive was the only metric that mattered. His color had come back enough to be recognizable as his actual color. Both of his hands had lines in them. The monitor beside his bed was steady and unremarkable. His eyes were open. Laura pulled the chair to the side of the bed and sat down so he didn't have to turn his head. Hey, she said. Hey. His voice was hoarse and thin. He swallowed. Rourke told me. He stopped, collected himself. Talking was costing him something right now. Told me what happened this morning, what they did to you. Don't worry about that. I'm worrying about it. His eyes had a clarity that pain medication sometimes burned off, the kind of sharp, stripped-down awareness that came from a body working very hard at the basic business of surviving. I need to tell you something, before I'm out again. Salcedo. I knew something was wrong here, he said. Not here specifically, but I've had contacts in Callaway, people I served with who've had family members treated at this hospital. There have been... Another stop, another careful breath. There have been things that didn't add up. I flagged it through my unit 6 months ago. I don't know where it went. Laura was very still. You flagged a concern about this hospital 6 months ago, she said. Informal, to my unit's medical liaison. I don't know if it went anywhere. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. I'm telling you because whatever's happening now, whatever they're looking at, there might be more than what you filed. There might be things nobody's found yet. She sat with that for 3 seconds that felt considerably longer. I'll tell Fielding, she said. He nodded, which looked like it cost him something. Get some sleep, she said. Let OC put you back under. You did your part. Did I? His mouth did something that might have been a smile on a day when his face wasn't working so hard at other things. I mostly just got blown up and asked for you. That was enough, Laura said. She left the room and stood in the ICU hallway and thought about informal reports flagged to medical liaisons 6 months ago that may or may not have gone anywhere, and about Warren Yip's memos that hadn't gone anywhere, and about the patients whose outcomes she had documentation for and the ones whose outcomes she might not. She thought about there might be more than what you filed. She was still thinking about it when the ICU unit door at the far end of the hallway opened, and one of Fielding's officers came through moving with a purpose that was different from the purposeful movement she'd been watching all day, and stopped when he saw her and said, Ms. Reyes, I need you to come with me right now. What happened? We pulled the patient records you gave Major Fielding the identifiers for. The September cases. He was already moving back toward the door. There are 7 more. Laura followed him without another word, and behind her the ICU door swung shut on the sound of Dario Salcedo's monitor counting out its steady rhythm into the quiet of the room, and somewhere in the administrative wing of Hartwell Memorial Hospital, in an office where a vanilla candle had long since burned itself out, a phone rang and rushed and went unanswered. 7 more. Laura repeated it in her head as she followed Fielding's officer back through the ICU door and down the corridor toward the elevator, not because she needed to process the number, but because she needed a second to absorb what it meant in terms of scope. She had documented 9 cases. The system showed 7 that she hadn't touched. 7 additional patients whose records had anomalies matching the pattern she'd identified in September, cases that predated her tenure at Hartwell or fell outside the specific incidents she'd flagged, which meant the problem was larger than her documentation, larger than her 4 years here, larger than anything the performance review or the termination paperwork had been designed to contain. The elevator opened on the ground floor and she followed the officer, Lieutenant Graves, he'd told her his name at some point, she was placing it now, through the main corridor toward the East Conference Wing, where Fielding had set up what had quietly become, over the course of the evening, something closer to a field operations center than a records review. 2 more people she hadn't seen before were working at the table. The portable printer was still going. Someone had brought in a second laptop. Fielding was standing at the head of the table with Warren Yip beside her, and both of them were looking at something on a screen that they angled toward Laura when she came in. "Sit down," Fielding said. Laura sat. Warren identified the 7 additional cases by running a cross-reference on the deletion audit trail. Every record that was deleted or modified using administrative credentials in the past 22 months shows up in the log. When we pulled the clinical context for each one, Fielding gestured at the screen. 7 of them involve post-surgical patients under Dr. Hale's primary care. The documentation anomalies in each case follow a consistent pattern. Drainage output recorded at values that differ from nursing observation notes, filed within the same 12-hour window. The nursing notes weren't modified? Laura asked. No, only the physician-side documentation and the official outcome records. Yip's voice was carefully flat, the voice of someone delivering information that disgusted him while maintaining the professional composure the situation required. The nursing notes are still there. They don't match. Laura understood what that meant immediately, and she could see from the way Fielding was watching her that Fielding understood it too. The nursing notes were the cross-reference that exposed the falsification. They'd been left intact, probably because modifying them would have required accessing a different system with different credentials, and whoever was doing this had either not thought that far ahead or had decided the nursing documentation was too granular to draw scrutiny. That was the mistake. In a paper-based system, it would never have surfaced. In a system where 2 separate documentation streams existed side by side, it left a seam. "What are the clinical outcomes for the 7 cases?" Laura asked. Yip and Fielding exchanged a look. 3 patients had extended post-surgical stays with complications that were documented as unrelated to the initial procedure, Fielding said. In each of those 3 cases, the complication is consistent with inadequate post-surgical drainage monitoring. Consistent with or caused by? That determination requires clinical review we haven't completed yet, but consistent with. Laura sat back. 3 patients with complications. Potentially caused by drainage output that had been recorded inaccurately. Numbers that made management decisions look appropriate when the actual clinical picture warranted something different. She didn't know the specifics of each case, couldn't assess causation from where she sat tonight. But the architecture of it was clear enough. It wasn't just documentation. It was documentation in service of covering clinical errors, errors that had consequences. "Has anyone notified those patients?" she asked. "Not yet. That's part of the formal investigation process and will be coordinated through the state health department. They need to know." "Ms. Reyes, I understand the process. I'm telling you they need to know as soon as the process allows it, not when it's legally tidy, as soon as it's allowed." Fielding held her gaze for a moment. "Noted," she said, "and I agree." At 9:20 p.m., Dr. Marcus Hale's attorney, a man named Gerald Frost, whose suits cost more than most people's car payments, and who had the practiced ease of someone retained specifically for situations like this one, appeared in the corridor outside the conference room and asked to speak with Major Fielding. Laura stayed at the table and watched through the glass partition as Fielding went out to meet him. She couldn't hear the conversation. She could read the body language well enough. Frost did most of the talking. Fielding listened with her arms at her sides and her face doing nothing in particular, which was a skill Laura had always respected in anyone who had it. When Frost finished, Fielding said something brief. Frost's posture changed fractionally, not dramatically, just the small adjustment of someone recalibrating expectations. Fielding came back in. He wanted to know the scope of the investigation, she said, specifically whether it would extend to Dr. Hale's previous hospital affiliations. What did you tell him? I told him I couldn't discuss the scope of an ongoing investigation. She sat down, which he'll correctly interpret as yes. Laura hadn't known about previous affiliations until that moment. She filed it. Where did Hale practice before Hartwell? 2 facilities, one in Wyoming, one in Idaho, both within the past 8 years. Fielding picked up a page from the stack in front of her. We made inquiries this afternoon. Wyoming facility tells us Hale's surgical privileges were voluntarily surrendered in 2019 during an internal peer review process. Idaho facility tells us he departed following a board review in 2021. Neither facility has litigation pending against him currently, but the Wyoming case involved a patient complaint regarding post-surgical monitoring that was settled out of court. The room was very quiet. He's done this before, Laura said. The investigation will determine he's done this before. She wasn't raising her voice. She was just saying the thing that the facts in front of her added up to, clearly, and without room for a more charitable reading. The voluntary surrender in Wyoming, the board review in Idaho. He comes somewhere new, the pattern continues, and whatever documentation exists gets managed until it doesn't. Fielding set the page down. That's what the investigation is for. I know. Laura looked at the table for a moment. The September reports I filed, the 2 that were deleted, they documented the drainage discrepancy pattern in 2 consecutive cases. If those reports had stayed in the system, the peer review process here would have had enough to flag a pattern review. Yes. Who deleted them? It wasn't a question, not exactly. She already knew the answer was somewhere in the administrative credential log. The deletion was performed using a credential set registered to Todd Garfield, Fielding said. Garfield is your HR representative. Laura thought about Garfield sitting in the performance review, typing. Thought about the way he'd slid the termination paperwork across the desk. Thought about the specific efficiency of a man doing a job he'd been told to do by someone who had more power than he did, and who he had probably decided it was safer to accommodate than to refuse. Is he talking? He lawyered up about 20 minutes after we identified his credentials in the log, Fielding said, which is, honestly, informative in its own way. 10. By 10 p.m., the hospital had the specific quality of a place where the official version of events is actively dying. Laura could feel it in the building, in the way the nursing staff moved differently through the corridors than they had at 6, less performatively busy, more genuinely unsettled. She passed 2 nurses in the main corridor who went quiet when they saw her, not with hostility, but with something closer to the awkwardness of people who had been told a story and were now realizing the story had been wrong. Sandra found her near the vending machines in the main corridor, the only food option available at this hour, as it turned out, and Laura was standing in front of them with her wallet out and the unsatisfying knowledge that what she actually wanted was a real meal. There's leftover soup in the break room fridge, Sandra said, from morning handoff. It's not great, but it's food. I'm not supposed to be in the break room. Sandra made a face that suggested she found this technicality unimpressive given the circumstances. Come on. The break room was empty. The soup was chicken noodle from a can, reheated in a paper cup in the microwave, and it was genuinely not great, but it was warm and it was real, and Laura ate it standing at the counter while Sandra sat on the edge of the table and said nothing for a while. Garfield, Sandra said eventually. Yeah. I knew he was. Sandra stopped, reworked it. I didn't think he was actively falsifying anything. I thought he was the kind of person who does what he's told without asking what the instructions are actually for. That's probably accurate and also not particularly exculpatory. No. Sandra picked at a paper napkin. Forsyth is still in her office. Someone said she's been on the phone with the hospital board. There's supposed to be an emergency board call tonight. Who told you that? Donna at the front desk. Who got it from Phil in facilities, who apparently heard it from one of the board members' assistants who called looking for a conference line. Laura ate her soup. The information chain from board assistant to facilities to front desk to charge nurse was so specifically absurdly human in its operation that she felt something loosen in her chest for the first time all day. Not quite a laugh, but adjacent to one. How are you doing? Sandra asked. And don't say fine. Laura put the empty cup down and thought about it honestly. I'm tired, she said, and She stopped. I'm still processing what the 7 additional cases mean. Clinically. For those patients. The 3 with complications. Yeah. Sandra was quiet. They both understood what that meant without elaborating it, because they were both people who had spent careers in clinical settings where the gap between complication as a chart notation and complication as something that happened to a person you'd never met was something you had to consciously hold on to. That's on him, Sandra said. Not on you. I know, and I also know I was here for 4 years and I caught 9 cases. There were 7 more I didn't see. You can't see everything. I know that too. She did know it. It didn't fully help yet. It would, eventually, in the way that things you know intellectually work their way into the other parts of you over time. The emergency board call happened at 10:45. Laura knew it had concluded at 11:18 because Diane Forsyth emerged from her office at 11:23 and walked through the administrative wing past the conference room where Fielding's team was still working. And the look on Forsyth's face was the look of someone who had just spent 30 minutes on a call during which the precise nature and limits of her institutional protection had been made very clear. She did not look at Laura. She walked past the conference room with her eyes forward and her jaw set, and she went to the elevator, and the doors closed. Fielding came out of the conference room shortly after. The board has placed Dr. Hale on immediate suspension of surgical privileges pending the outcome of the investigation, she said. The board chair has formally requested that the state investigation proceed without hospital interference and has offered full cooperation with record access. That's a significant shift from where they were at 6 o'clock. What shifted them? The Wyoming and Idaho information. Once we made those inquiries this afternoon, the board had access to the same pattern we're seeing. A board that continues to protect a physician with that record while a state and federal investigation is active takes on a specific kind of liability. Fielding paused. Also, Frost, Hale's attorney, apparently advised Hale to cooperate with the initial interview request, which Hale then declined to follow. He refused to cooperate? He agreed to an interview and then, in the interview, declined to answer questions relating to the records and instead made what Graves described as an extended statement about nursing staff exceeding their professional scope. Fielding's expression remained neutral with some effort, which was not, under the circumstances, an effective strategy. Laura absorbed that. Hale, in a room with a military JAG officer and a state health department reviewer, had decided to make a statement about nurses overstepping. She thought about the man she'd watched override a patient safety flag and explained to her, with 22 years of credentials in his voice, that she was a floor nurse and he was a board-certified surgeon. She thought, "You told that story one too many times." "What happens to him?" she asked. Suspension is the first step. The state nursing and medical boards will conduct their own proceedings in parallel with the health department investigation. Given the Wyoming precedent and the documentation we have here, the likelihood is that his license review will be serious and the outcome will be significant. Fielding chose her next words carefully. "I can't tell you what the end result will be. I can tell you that the record that exists tonight is not a record that is easy to walk back from." Laura nodded. "And Forsyth, Garfield?" Forsyth authorized the performance review and signed the termination order. Her direct legal exposure depends on what the investigation finds about what she knew and when. If she knew the timestamp modifications had happened before she signed the warning and the termination, that's a different situation than if Garfield acted without her direct knowledge. Fielding paused. My read, for what it's worth, is that she knew enough to know she should have asked more questions and chose not to. Whether that rises to the level of legal liability or remains a professional and ethical failure is something the review will determine. And Garfield's credential is on the deletion log. He's going to have a harder time. Laura left the hospital at 12:40 a.m. She retrieved her jacket and the box, still sitting near the lobby entrance where Carl had left it, which said something about the evening, and walked through the sliding doors into the cold Montana night. The temperature had dropped into the low 30s and the parking structure was lit orange-yellow and mostly empty. Her breath fogged in front of her. She put the box in her trunk and got into the driver's seat and sat for a moment with the engine off, hands in her lap. She was thinking about Salcedo's voice. There might be more than what you filed. And about 7 cases she hadn't seen, and about 3 patients with complications who didn't yet know what the investigation had found. She was thinking about Warren Yip's memos. 14 months of careful bureaucratic concern landing in a system designed to absorb and neutralize exactly that kind of concern. She was thinking about Corporal Tate on the helicopter, handbagging a commander at 15 liters of oxygen, deciding to hold off on the needle decompression because she wasn't confident enough in the presentation to risk doing it wrong. Good instinct, Laura had thought, knowing what you don't know. She started the car and drove out of the parking structure into the empty streets of Callaway at 12:40 in the morning, and she had been driving for about 6 minutes when her phone rang through the car speakers. It was Rourke. She picked up. Sorry for the hour, he said. It's fine. Salcedo came out of the second sedation about 20 minutes ago. He's been asking for an update. I told him I'd call you. Tell him the suspension is in. Hale's out of surgery pending investigation. The state process is moving. A pause. He's going to ask how you are. Tell him I'm fine. Are you? She thought about that honestly, the way Sandra had asked her to. Ask me in a week, she said. She could hear something in Rourke's end of the call. Hospital sounds, the specific background of a late-night ICU corridor. She'd spent so many hours in places that sounded exactly like that. There's something else, Rourke said. She waited. My JAG officer finished her preliminary report about an hour ago. The part that relates to you... He paused, and she heard him choosing something. She's recommending the military formally recognize your actions today as constituting emergency medical care under the Special Operations Medical Directive. That has implications for your licensing status, your professional record, and any potential liability from performing the procedure without local privileges. It essentially puts a federal stamp on the medical necessity of what you did. Okay, Laura said. That's it? Okay. I did what needed doing. If the paperwork reflects that, I'm glad. But it wasn't why I did it. I know that, Rourke said. That's actually why the paperwork says what it says. She drove through a green light on an empty intersection, and the streets were very quiet and the mountains were invisible in the dark, but she knew they were there. Rourke. Yeah. Salcedo said he flagged a concern about this hospital 6 months ago through his unit's medical liaison. I told Fielding tonight. Did you know about it? A longer pause than the others. I knew he'd said something to someone, Rourke said. I didn't know the specifics. I don't know where it went. Can you find out? Already working on it. She turned onto her street. The house was dark, which was how she'd left it at 5:30 this morning, an unimaginable number of hours ago. Go get some sleep, Rourke said. Yeah. She pulled into the driveway. Tell Salcedo the system worked. Eventually. Even after they fired you and walked you out with a cardboard box. Even after. She sat in the parked car for a moment after the call ended. Through the windshield, the sky was very black and very clear, and the stars over Callaway were the kind of thick and close that only happened at altitude and in real cold, and she sat there for 2 more minutes before she got out. She was halfway up the porch steps when her phone buzzed with a text. Unknown number, but the area code was Helena, the state capital where the health department was based. She opened it. Miss Reyes. Owen Treadwell. I apologize for the hour. A development you should be aware of before morning. We requested Dr. Hale's complete credentialing file from the hospital's HR system tonight. The file they provided is incomplete. His prior hospital history, Wyoming, Idaho, was redacted from the version in Hartwell's internal records. Someone at this facility deliberately removed the employment history that would have revealed his pattern at previous institutions. This was done at the time of his hiring. We believe this may extend beyond Hale himself. The investigation is expanding. I will be in contact tomorrow. Laura read it twice, standing on her own porch in the dark. She had assumed this was about Hale, about the records he'd falsified, the errors he'd covered, the system that had let him do it. She had assumed that Forsyth and Garfield had enabled him because it was easier, and because he had leverage, and because institutions protect their assets even when those assets are doing damage. She had not assumed that someone had deliberately removed his employment history at the point of hiring, which meant someone at Hartwell Memorial had known exactly who Marcus Hale was when they brought him in, which meant the question was no longer why Hale had been protected after the fact. The question was who had wanted him here in the first place, and why, and what they had expected him to do. She lowered her phone and stood in the cold Montana dark and looked at nothing in particular while the shape of something much larger than one surgeon's misconduct assembled itself in the part of her mind that had spent years learning to identify the difference between a problem and the problem behind the problem. Her front door was 10 feet away. Her house was dark and warm inside, and she hadn't slept in 20 hours. She went inside, sat at her kitchen table with her coat still on, and opened her laptop. She sent the message at 1:17 a.m. and sat for another minute looking at the sent confirmation, then closed the laptop and went to bed with her coat still draped over the chair and her shoes still on the floor beside it, because some nights the distance between the couch and the bedroom is the last thing you have energy to negotiate. She slept without dreaming, which was a mercy. Treadwell called at 7:40 the next morning. Laura was already up, had been since 6:15, coffee made. Her printed notes spread across the kitchen table alongside the laptop, the 27-page document open again. She'd been going through it with the particular focus of someone who has slept enough to think clearly, but not so long that the urgency has drained away. She picked up on the first ring. "Your message last night," Treadwell said. "We've been working since 5 a.m. What did you find?" Philip Dunn was not just an executive at Ridgecrest. He was the VP of Medical Affairs during the peer review period that resulted in Hale's voluntary privilege surrender. A pause that had weight in it. The peer review findings were sealed under a confidentiality agreement as part of the surrender terms. Standard practice in that era. Hospitals used to do this routinely to avoid the appearance of formal disciplinary action. It protected the physician and it protected the facility. And it meant the findings didn't follow him. Correct. No formal disciplinary record. Voluntary surrender looks, on paper, like a physician choosing to redirect his practice. It's only when you have the internal peer review documents, which we are now in the process of subpoenaing from Ridgecrest's successor organization, that you see what actually happened. Another pause. "Ms. Reyes, the preliminary picture we're building suggests that Dunn was aware of the full scope of Hale's conduct in Wyoming and facilitated his placement at Hartwell anyway. Possibly because Hartwell was a smaller regional facility where the oversight infrastructure was less robust." Laura looked at her kitchen wall. "He found him a softer target," she said. "That's one way to put it. Our investigators are also looking at whether there was a financial relationship between Dunn and Hale that predates the Hartwell appointment. We don't have that confirmed yet." "What happens to Dunn?" "He resigned from the board at 6:15 this morning, before we made contact." Treadwell's voice was dry. "Which tells you something about what he understood last night when the investigation scope became public." "Resigning doesn't close it." "No, it doesn't. The resignation will be the first sentence of his story, not the last." He paused. "I wanted to call you early because there's something happening today that you should know about before it becomes public. The State Board of Medicine is holding an emergency session this afternoon. Hale's license review is being fast-tracked given the pattern documentation and the prior facility history. Emergency sessions of this kind are unusual. They happen when the board believes the public safety risk is active enough that the standard timeline is inadequate." Laura absorbed that. "What's the likely outcome?" "I can't tell you what the board will decide. I can tell you that I have been in this role for 11 years, and I have seen 3 emergency sessions in that time. In all 3 cases, the license was suspended pending full investigation. He let that sit for a moment. I'll be in contact when the session concludes. She hung up and stood at the kitchen counter with her coffee going cold in her hand. It was 7:52 in the morning. 26 hours ago, she had been in this same kitchen, coat on, shoes on the floor, too tired to process the shape of what she'd found. Now the shape was clearer, and it was uglier than she had imagined when she'd filed her first incident report 14 months ago, and she had imagined something fairly ugly even then. She'd thought she was documenting a surgeon who made mistakes and refused to acknowledge them. That was bad enough. The thing underneath it, the deliberate concealment at the credentialing level, the board member who had carried the secret from one state to the next and installed Hale somewhere the oversight was thinner, that was a different category of wrong. It meant the patients at Hartwell hadn't just been failed by one physician's arrogance. They'd been placed in the path of that arrogance by people who already knew what it did. She poured the cold coffee down the drain and made fresh. She drove to the hospital at 9 a.m., not because she worked there. She did not, technically, work there, but because Fielding had called at 8:30 and asked her to come in to review the preliminary findings document before it was formally submitted. She had no legal obligation to do this. She also had 14 months of documentation that represented the factual foundation of everything the investigation had found, and if her review caught an error or a gap, it was worth the hour. She also, if she was honest with herself, wanted to see the building in daylight with everything changed. The parking structure looked the same. The east entrance looked the same. Carl was at the security desk and looked up when she came through and said, "Morning, Ms. Reyes," in the careful tone of someone who had spent the previous evening recalibrating a significant number of assumptions. "Morning, Carl." She went to the conference room. Fielding was there with Lieutenant Graves and a woman from the state health department named Ana Peralta, who had the compact efficiency of someone who processed institutional malfeasance for a living and had developed a specific immunity to being surprised by it. They went through the preliminary findings document for 90 minutes, Laura flagging 2 timeline inaccuracies and 1 patient identifier that had been transposed, Peralta correcting them in real time, Fielding making notes on a separate document that was the outline of the formal submission. It was detailed work. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of thing that actually held cases together when they went to formal review, which nobody outside of these rooms ever saw or thought about, and which mattered enormously. At 10:40, Sandra Page knocked on the conference room door. "Forsyth is out," she said. She looked like someone delivering news she'd been carrying for a few hours and hadn't had a chance to set down. Came in this morning, met with the board rep for about 40 minutes, and left. Her office is empty. Someone's already been in there going through her files. "Board-ordered review?" Fielding asked. "I think so. I don't know who authorized it." Sandra looked at Laura. "Garfield didn't come in. HR is operating with 2 people I've never seen before who are apparently from some kind of external compliance firm." Laura nodded. The institution was doing what institutions do when they realize the structure that has been protecting a problem has become the liability. It was shedding the structure. Fast, and with the particular efficiency of people who understood that the speed of the shedding was the only variable they still controlled. "How's the floor?" Laura asked. Sandra thought about it honestly. "Scared, mostly. People don't know what the investigation is going to find about the cases they were involved in, whether they're going to be implicated in something they didn't know was happening." She paused. "A lot of the nursing staff are asking about you." "What are they asking?" "Whether you're coming back." Laura looked at the table. She didn't have an answer to that yet, and she wasn't going to manufacture one, so she said, "I don't know," which was true, and Sandra accepted it. The State Medical Board's emergency session concluded at 2:17 p.m. Treadwell texted the outcome before the formal press release went out. "License suspended, effective immediately, pending full disciplinary investigation. Board statement will cite patient safety and pattern of conduct across multiple facilities." Statement releases at 3 p.m. Laura was in the hospital cafeteria when the text came in, eating an actual meal for the first time in nearly 30 hours. A plate of food that was unremarkable in every way and which tasted under the circumstances better than it had any right to. She read the text twice, set the phone face down on the table, and finished eating. At 3 p.m., she was back in the conference room when someone pulled up the board's press release on a laptop and read the relevant section aloud. The language was formal and institutional, pattern of conduct inconsistent with the standards required for the protection of patients, but the content was unambiguous. Marcus Hale could not practice medicine in the state of Montana, could not operate, could not hold privileges at any facility. The investigation would determine whether the suspension became permanent, and based on what the record contained, the board's direction was not subtle. The room was quiet when Graves finished reading. Peralta said, "Idaho and Wyoming will move within the week. Once one board acts this publicly, the others follow. They don't want to be the state that kept his license active after this." Laura thought about the patients in Wyoming, in Idaho, who had encountered Marcus Hale at a time when nobody had assembled the full picture yet. She thought about what it would mean for them to read that press release, whether it would be closure or whether it would be the beginning of a different and harder set of questions about what had been done to them and what they were owed. Probably both, she decided. Probably both at the same time and for a long time. She went up to see Salcedo at 4 p.m. He was awake and sitting up at about 30 degrees, which was more upright than the day before, and the color in his face was closer to his actual color now. He still looked like someone who had 4 hours of chest surgery 30 hours ago, which was to say he looked like he was in real pain and working around it with the practiced stubbornness of a person who had been in real pain before and knew what it did and didn't require from him. Rourke was in the chair by the window, which Laura suspected was where Rourke had spent most of the last 24 hours. "You look better," she told Salcedo. "I look terrible," he said. "Better than yesterday." "That's a low bar." He shifted, winced fractionally, steadied. "Rourke's been giving me updates." "I know." "Dunn resigned." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, processing. "I put a concern in through my unit, and it didn't go anywhere. That's been bothering me." "It went somewhere," Laura said. "It's possible it went into a system that wasn't designed to catch this specific thing. It's possible it went to someone who didn't know what to do with it. It's also possible—" She stopped. "Possible it went somewhere and got buried," he said. "That's being looked at." He nodded. The nod cost him something. She could see the muscle compensation his body was doing around the rib repairs. He'd be doing that for weeks. "I should have pushed harder on it." "You flagged it through your chain. That's what the chain is for." "And then I almost died on a helicopter because the chain didn't work." She didn't have a clean answer to that, because he was right. The chain hadn't worked. She had spent 14 months working inside a system that had been actively compromised and filing reports through a process that someone was quietly dismantling, and the only reason any of it had come undone was that a military helicopter had landed on a roof and a patient had said her name before losing consciousness. That was not a system working. That was a lucky intersection of circumstances that had produced an outcome the system was supposed to produce on its own. "I know," she said. Salcedo looked at her. "Does it bother you?" How close it was. She thought about it seriously, the way she'd made herself think about things seriously all day. "Yes," she said. "It bothers me that it took this to open it up. It bothers me that Warren Yip wrote 3 memos over 18 months and nothing happened. It bothers me that there are 3 patients who had complications they might not have had." She paused. "And it bothers me that somewhere there's another hospital and another Hale, and the mechanisms that are supposed to catch it are run by people who are making the same calculations Forsyth made. So what do you do with that?" It was a genuine question, not rhetorical. She could tell by the way he was looking at her. The particular attention of someone who thought the answer mattered and wanted to hear what it actually was. "You keep filing," she said. "You keep the copies at home. You know what to do when the system fails, and you do it anyway, and you push for the system to be less likely to fail the next time." She looked at her hands for a moment. "And you find the Warren Yips, the people who are already doing it quietly in the places where nobody's looking. You make sure they're not doing it alone." Salcedo was quiet for a moment. Then, "Rourke told me about the preliminary findings document, that your records were the core of it. They were part of it. He said without your copies, the timeline falls apart." Laura didn't respond. "You kept them at home because you knew," Salcedo said. "You knew before you could prove it that the system wasn't safe." I knew how it usually goes. That's not nothing. That's actually... He stopped, adjusted the thought. A lot of people would have trusted the system. A lot of people do. That's not always wrong. She looked at him. The system is supposed to be trustworthy. Wanting it to be is not naive. Working to make it actually be is the point. He almost smiled. The same almost smile as the night before. The one that was working against the constraints of his face being occupied with other things. Get some rest, she said. Let Ose do her job. I'm going to write a statement, he said, when I can, about what you did. For the record. You don't have to. I know, I'm going to anyway. She stood up. Thank you for saying my name before you went under. He looked at her. Thank you for picking up the box and walking back in. She left the room. Checked. The formal letter arrived 11 days later. It came from the Montana State Nursing Board on official letterhead, and it was 4 pages long. The first page was a summary. The subsequent 3 pages were documentation. Laura read all 4 pages at her kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with coffee that was actually hot this time, and she read them in order without skipping ahead because she had learned a long time ago that the details mattered and that skipping to the conclusion before you'd earned it by going through the material was how you missed things. The letter formally cleared her professional record of the disciplinary warning and the termination. It stated that the documentation review had determined both actions to be based on falsified or improperly modified records, and therefore without legitimate professional basis. It stated that her patient safety reporting had been conducted in accordance with both state nursing standards and the Joint Commission guidelines the hospital operated under. It stated, in language that was formal but unambiguous, that her clinical judgment had been correct in each documented case. It also contained something she hadn't expected in the final substantive paragraph before the closing formalities. The board was recommending her for recognition under the state's Patient Safety Advocate Program, which was a designation that existed mostly on paper and was awarded rarely and which carried with it an invitation to participate in the board's policy review committee for patient safety reporting systems. She put the letter down and looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, which was still mostly frozen at this point in the Montana calendar, but which had the particular look of ground that was thinking about thawing. She thought about Warren Yip, who had spent 18 months writing memos into a system that absorbed them without consequence, and who had finally made a different call. She thought about what it would mean to sit on a committee that reviewed the systems that produced that kind of outcome, and whether the committee would actually be able to change anything, or whether it would be the bureaucratic version of the same memos going into the same void. She thought, it might be both. The memos, and the committee, and the change. All of it at once for a long time, without a clean ending. She was okay with that. The public accounting came in stages, which was how it always came. Not in one dramatic moment, but in a series of documented outcomes that accumulated into something that couldn't be walked back. Marcus Hale's medical license was suspended in Montana, then revoked in Idaho, then placed under formal investigation in Wyoming, where the sealed peer review records had been successfully subpoenaed and were now part of an active state inquiry. The Wyoming investigation also opened a separate track on the confidentiality agreement that had allowed the peer review findings to be sealed in the first place, examining whether that agreement had been used to obstruct the reporting obligations that facilities had to disclose known disciplinary findings to subsequent employers. That track had Philip Dunn's name on it in large letters. Dunn's resignation from the Hartwell board did not close his exposure, as Treadwell had predicted. The financial relationship investigators had been looking for turned out to be a consulting arrangement. Dunn had been paid, through a shell entity, for what were described as physician recruitment services related to Hale's placement at Hartwell. The arrangement had not been disclosed to the board at the time of Hale's credentialing. It had not been disclosed to anyone. It was the kind of arrangement that was technically possible to structure in ways that existed in legal gray areas, and Dunn had structured it in one of those ways, and the question of whether it crossed from gray into black was now in the hands of a federal prosecutor in Helena whose interest had been activated by the military angle of the investigation. Diane Forsyth resigned from Hartwell Memorial 2 weeks after the investigation became public. She did not issue a statement. Her resignation letter, which was obtained through a public records request by a reporter from the Billings Gazette, who had been tracking the story since the helicopters landed, cited personal reasons and thanked the hospital for the opportunity to serve. The board accepted the resignation and appointed an interim director within 48 hours, which suggested the board had been prepared for it. Todd Garfield's situation was the most legally complicated because the credential deletion log had his name on it, but his cooperation, once his attorney negotiated the terms of it, was also the thing that confirmed the chain of instruction that had led to the deletion. He had not acted alone. He had acted on instruction from someone whose credential he'd been told to cover for, and the documentation of that instruction, once Garfield's attorney agreed to provide it, shifted significant weight from Garfield himself toward the people who had directed him. It did not make Garfield a hero. It made him a smaller piece of a larger story, which was probably the most accurate description of what he was. The Billings Gazette story ran on a Sunday morning and was picked up by regional outlets across the Northwest by that afternoon. It was thorough and it was reported carefully, and it did the thing that good reporting does when it works. It told the story in a way that made the sequence of events legible to people who had not been in the rooms where they happened. The patients who had experienced complications appeared in the story without their names, described in terms that were accurate without being exploitative. The 3 patients with post-surgical complications that were potentially linked to inadequate monitoring had been individually contacted by the state health department by this point and provided with information about the review process and their options. That was not a small thing, even though it happened in private, even though it didn't appear prominently in the article. Laura was mentioned by name. She had not given the reporter an interview, had declined twice, politely, but the reporting was sourced well enough that the story was accurate without her direct participation. It described her safety reporting, the investigation, her clinical actions during Salcedo's care, the formal clearing of her record. It described Hale's response to her safety flags in language that came from official documents rather than her characterization of events, which she thought was the right way to do it. She read the article on her phone, standing in her kitchen on a Sunday morning, and when she finished, she put the phone on the counter and stood there for a minute doing nothing in particular. It was over. The main shape of it, at least. The investigation would continue for months, probably longer in Wyoming, and Dunn's federal exposure would take longer than that to resolve, and the patients with complications had a long road that had nothing to do with investigations or press releases. Nothing was over for them. She held that honestly, without letting it recede into abstraction. But the version of it that had started in a conference room with vanilla candle smell and a termination letter slid across a desk, that was over. She went back to Hartwell on a Monday morning, 6 weeks after the helicopters, not because they'd asked her. She had been asked, formally, by the interim director, a woman named Constance Aberle, who had come in from outside the system and who had the look of someone appointed specifically to be uncontaminated by what had happened and therefore capable of cleaning it up. Aberle had called Laura 2 weeks earlier and had the kind of conversation that was straightforward without being transactional. She had offered restoration of position, review of compensation, and a specific guarantee written into any renewed employment agreement about the independence of patient safety reporting from administrative interference. Laura had said she would think about it. She had thought about it for 2 weeks. Walked through it from different angles, talked to Sandra about the floor, what it felt like now, who was still there and who had left. Talked to Rourke, who was back at his unit but had called twice, and who she'd found, somewhat to her surprise, to be someone she was genuinely glad to have in her phone. Talked to Salcedo, who had been discharged 12 days after surgery and had sent her a message from wherever he'd gone that said, "Only thank you," and "Don't disappear." She hadn't made the decision because anyone pushed her toward it. She'd made it because she had sat with it long enough that the honest answer became clear, which was that she wanted to go back. Not because going back was safe or because the institution had healed. Institutions didn't heal. They reformed at best, and reform was slow and uneven and required people willing to stay inside and push from within, rather than making a clean exit to somewhere that felt less complicated. She wanted to go back because the work was the work, and she was good at it, and the patients on that floor deserved someone who would still be there in 4 years, knowing exactly what the system could do to the people who tried to hold it accountable, and doing it anyway. She told Aberle yes. She walked through the east entrance at 5:57 a.m. on a Monday, 13 minutes before her shift. Carl looked up from the security desk and said, "Good morning, Ms. Reyes," in a voice that had lost the careful quality it had the last time, had gone back to ordinary, which she thought was the right register. "Morning, Carl." The ER was the same. The board, the rooms, the rhythm. Sandra was behind the nursing station desk and looked up when Laura came through the doors, and something in Sandra's face did a very specific thing that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite happiness, but was the expression of someone who has been holding a particular kind of tension for a long time and has just felt it release. "Hey," Sandra said. "Hey." New patient safety reporting protocol went live Thursday, Sandra said, which was Sandra's way of saying things are different now without making a speech about it. "I know. I helped draft it." Sandra smiled. It was the first uncomplicated smile Laura had seen on her face in a while. The shift started. The board filled. A man came in with chest pain that turned out to be musculoskeletal. A teenager with a laceration above her eye from a fall. A woman in her 60s with a blood pressure reading that her primary care doctor was going to hear about before the end of the day. The specific ordinary accumulation of people who needed something and had come to the place that was supposed to provide it. Laura moved through it the same way she always had, without announcement, without performance, paying attention to the things that needed attention and filing what needed to be filed and pushing back when pushing back was what the situation required. At 9:30, she filed an incident report. A medication order. A prescribing resident, not a bad one, just moving fast and missing an interaction in a patient's history. She flagged it through the new system, which routed it to the clinical pharmacist and the attending simultaneously with a mandatory 48-hour response requirement and a chain of documentation that couldn't be accessed for modification by administrative credentials. The pharmacist responded in 11 minutes. The order was adjusted. The patient never knew it had happened. That was how it was supposed to work. That was how it had always been supposed to work, and it had taken a year of documentation, a military helicopter, a compliance officer with enough nerve to call the right number, and the particular collision of circumstances that nobody had planned and everybody had been a part of to get it to the place where it actually did. Laura updated the chart and moved on to the next patient. She didn't think about what it had cost, not right then. That accounting existed, and she carried it honestly. The months of being dismissed, the performance review, the morning she had walked out with a box and felt the cold come in before the anger did. The 3 patients who had complications. The families who were still working through what the review had found and what it meant for them. Warren Yip, who had sent her a short email that said, "I'm glad you kept your copies," and who was now sitting on the same policy review committee she'd been invited to join. None of it was clean. None of it resolved into something that felt finished, because that was not what real things felt like when they finished. They felt like this, like a shift starting, like a board filling, like work continuing, like the knowledge that the system was a little more honest than it had been, and that honesty had been paid for by people who had refused to stop telling the truth, even when telling it cost them something real. She had been underestimated in that building. She had been dismissed, papered over, walked out. And she had also, without planning it, without performing it, simply by doing the job the way the job was supposed to be done, she had become the person the building couldn't function without. Not because of the helicopters, not because of the soldiers or the commander or the investigation that had blown the whole thing open. Those things had revealed what was already true. She had been that person all along. That was the thing about quiet strength. It didn't announce itself. It didn't need to be discovered by the right circumstances to be real. It was real the whole time. The circumstances just made it visible to the people who hadn't been paying attention. Laura Reyes clocked in, pulled the next chart, and went to work.